Hello, BookTube. I've got another starter kit for you today, this time on the Middle Ages, the so-called medieval period, where we will be looking at some major stuff that you should probably read to start your journey in understanding that period. And before we start into that, I want to offer the same kind of precautionary warning that I did in the last couple of starter kits. This is a subject that tends to bring out the worst in pretentious people, in pretentious, condescending know-it-alls. And if you are one of those people and you were brought here from outside the normal community of this channel by the title or by a search or by the algorithm, who knows how it happens, and you are tempted to leave a pretentious, condescending comment, please don't. It is, in addition to being unbelievably rude, it's also a waste of your time, because I'm going to remove it. I'm not going to engage with it. I'm not going to respond to it or rebut it. I'm just going to remove it. It's probably going to be personally insulting anyway, and the one kind of comment I am guaranteed to remove from this channel is anything that's personally insulting. But in this case, it doesn't need to be personally insulting for me to remove it anyway, because I'm warning you ahead of time. This subject tends to bring out the pretentious and condescending in the worst kind of readers, and if you are one of those people who was brought here by accident, refrain from leaving a comment of that kind. So no concern trolling. No, gee, I hope you're all right. I ask only because I'm surprised that St. Palernus of Samothrace was not on your list when a 5-year-old knows that he should be. Stuff like that. Whether it's that or the outright just hurled rocks, doesn't matter. I'm going to remove the comment anyway, so you are wasting your time to leave it. Now that we've got that out of the way, we will talk about this particular period. And in order to do that, we probably need to define our terms, right, as to what we're referring to here. And these will be my terms, of course. And as far as I'm concerned, the medieval period, the Middle Ages, have a more or less nebulous period to begin with, the end of the 5th century. So it's not a discrete day, it's not a discrete year, but it's not unending either. It's no more than 50 years in either direction. It's what I'm thinking of is the end of the 5th century. What I'm thinking of is the dissolution and fragmentation of Rome's control over its western provinces. So when that centralized secular authority starts to disappear, there is still a centralized authority, of course, there is still the church, but where that controlling secular authority starts to fragment and fritter away. So the end of the 5th century is roughly what I'm thinking of as the beginning of the medieval period. If you want to talk about it in literary terms, pretty much anything major after St. Augustine. This is very vague, I know. The end of the medieval period is far more specific in my mind, just because my Jesuitical mind frame makes me want to have specifics in that regard. And that would be a discrete year, 1485. The Battle of Bosworth Field, the end of the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses, it's a big, tangled subject, and it's only going to come up tangentially in this video. But it is quintessentially medieval, in a way that I would argue isn't exclusively recognizable in the wars that came to the same period, to the same territory, to the same cities post-Bosworth. I would argue that. I know that another popular terminal point for the Middle Ages is the opening of the New World, 1492. 1485, 1492, they're not that far apart, so we're going to say roughly then. I say 1485 and the death of Richard on the battlefield. The start of new dynastic realities that would have to deal with a new world eventually. But anyway, so that's roughly what I'm talking about. Roughly the end of the 5th century to 1485, 1492, something like that. So 1,000 years. It's a long time. Obviously, it's longer than we can do justice to in a starter kit, but that's the whole nature of a starter kit. So if you're looking at this subject just from 30,000 feet, obviously one of the first things you're going to want is a broad history. Broad-stroked histories, so that you can get the outlines and maybe whatever of the details the author feels like including. Now, in relatively recent years, there's been one that was terrific. This is translated by Peter Lewis. This is Johann Fried's book, The Middle Ages. We've seen it on this channel. You saw me get the advanced copy. You saw me get the finished copy. It's really, really good. And works really well. This was done by a university press. I'm sure that the paperback out there is probably pricey. But this is a leading medieval scholar's look at his sort of classroom synthesis of the major issues and characters of this time period. So it works really well as a broad overview of the period that I'm talking about. Although I can't off the top of my head remember where Fried says it starts and where it ends. That tends to be a parlor game of some amusement. But you know where I do now. The late 5th century to my horse, a kingdom for a horse. The late 5th century to the Battle of Bosworth Field and the end of the Wars of the Roses. That's what I think is the parameter here. And if you're reading Johann Fried's book and you're thinking, oh, this is really good, and of course you will, because Steve doesn't recommend bad books. If you're reading it and you're thinking, this is really good, but it's awful tasteless oatmeal. It's awful stiff going. I thought this was a starter kit. This doesn't feel like a starter volume. It is, but you would be legitimate to feel that way. Unfortunately, there is a more popular audience alternative. And by popular, I don't mean dumb. I mean less experienced reading history. That's all. It's reading any kind of genre, you have to build up your muscles. You have to build up your bank of expertise. If you want a book that is more accessible, well, I can certainly recommend this, Powers and Thrones by Dan Jones. This is another one-volume history of the Middle Ages, and it is terrific. Fried's book is too, but this makes radically different narrative choices. Let's just put it that way. That's nice and euphemistic. This makes radically different narrative choices than Fried's book does. So you're in a lot more accessible company. This reads a lot more like a novel. So it depends really on what kind of history you feel like reading. They're both good. They're both competent. And then, those are two overviews. And then we can start to break down historical looks at the Middle Ages into more specialized things. There were, of course, this was 1,000 years. People lived and died. They had toothaches. They lost their children. They tilled their fields. They looked up at the stars and dreamed. Most of them couldn't read. Most of them couldn't write. A huge number of things happened, of course. But in the 1,000 years that I'm talking about, there were some signature things that happened. I wanted to show you a couple of histories on those signature things. So these are set in the broader context of the Middle Ages. In their own defense, their authors know that and do a good job of contextualizing. Usually the opening chapter and the introduction are what does that. First, I want to recommend an oldie but a goodie here. This is Charles Homer Haskins. This is his book, The Renaissance of the 12th Century. A book written in the full knowledge of the fact that the common reader, the normal reader of history, the non-specialist reader of history, is going to say the Renaissance is centuries after this. That the Middle Ages, for a long time, used to be referred to as the Dark Ages. They aren't referred to that anymore. Middle Ages, medieval period, whatever you want to call it, they aren't usually referred to as the Dark Ages anymore because there's nothing dark about them, as Haskins proves. There was learning going on everywhere. It's true that when you have a gigantic secular power like Rome fragment and fall, it's going to mean chaos, and chaos is illiterate. I am not going to reflect on current events here in the world. I'm merely going to remind you that chaos is illiterate. It hates libraries. It hates learning. So there will be a kind of metaphorical darkness. But it'll never be uniform, and it will never be very deep. And that's what this book is about. Now, scholarship has leapt beyond this thing. Scholars had critical opinions of it at the time, but it's tremendously thought-provoking and really readable. So I wanted to include it here. It is, after all, my starter kit. Then we can deal with another specialty. This is the 14th century. This is Barbara Tuchman's book, A Distant Mirror. We've done a book club meeting on this book, and I've recommended it many times before. This book deals with more or less the longer 14th century and the signature events that happened in it as a highlight of sort of the pinnacle of the Middle Ages. So, and it's also a terrific reading experience. When you're talking about the calamitous 14th century, the main thing that makes it calamitous is also one of those signature events that it isn't a single event, it was a chain of events, but one of those signature events that happened inside this 1,000-year span that we're looking at. And that is the bubonic plague, the Black Death, which came to Europe and wiped out whole neighborhoods, drove whole courts into hiding, delivered an entirely new world when the first few waves had passed. It delivered an entirely new world. In some places, a world so depopulated that it was unrecognizable from its previous state. It was an absolute natural world holocaust for Europe. And it has been itself the subject of many, many studies. I want to recommend to you a really good one and my favorite one, The Black Death by Philip Ziegler. This was the trade paperback that I read until my copy fell apart. I don't have a print and paper copy of this book at the moment. I'm sure it doesn't look like this, whatever's in print, but I bet it is still in print. It's classic. So I want to recommend that as an individual event that happened inside this period. Now, there's another individual event that happened inside the years we're talking about. It, of course, has been the subject of innumerable study and leads to whole fields of study of its own. But it is worth reading. It is worth reading about on its own. And that is 1066, William the Conqueror. And I have a slim little book that I've recommended a million times on this channel. David Howarth's book, 1066, is terrific. It is just terrific. It'll take you 2 hours to read. But it encompasses all the personalities, all the politics, and the significance of this event, which was little glimpsed at the time, but which is it's touched on now. So that's another thing, a discrete thing that happened in these years that I wanted to bring to your attention. And there's another thing, there's another discrete thing that happened in the 1,000 years that we're talking about. More or less, the ending point is probably 1066 itself. But it started in this time, and it is so freakish, and it is so compelling, so endlessly fascinating, that I had to put not only one book on the list for it, but a few books. And that is, of course, the weird eruption into the normal course of Western civilization of the Klingons. Halfway through the period that we're talking about, Western Europe was attacked by Klingons. And I mean, of course, the Vikings. The so-called Viking era happened very discreetly in this period. It happened with one signature event on Lindisfarne and moved on from there, where suddenly, in addition to everything else that was going on, all the field tilling that I mentioned, all the living and dying and working, all the striving, all the sickness, all the losing your children, all the staring at the stars and wondering if there's anyone out there. Who knows? All of that, all the striving with the church. All of that was just going on day by day by day, and then suddenly this happens. Suddenly Vikings start attacking. These gigantic, ferocious warriors who seem at first completely unbeatable. And to take whole kingdoms hostage. That is a fascinating subject on its own, right squarely in the middle of the medieval era that we're talking about. So I want to recommend a few books. I want to recommend Neil Price's book, Children of Ash and Elm. This is just a terrific one-volume overview of the Viking era. Very, very comprehensive. Then I want to recommend Lars Brown-Worth's book, The Sea Wolves, another soup to nuts history of the Viking era. Just terrific stuff. Really, obviously, much more vivid than Children of Ash and Elm. But both of them going into all the non-vivid details as well. The good histories of the Vikings always include the fact that there was more to them than just screaming men jumping out of longboats. there was a lot more to them than that. A lot of commercial elements, a lot of social and religious elements. And there have been 20 great histories of the Viking era in the last 20 years. There's one almost every year. And they all cover that aspect of it. But this is a little more vivid, so I thought I would include this as well. And while we're talking about the Vikings, I thought I would throw in a recurrent note in these starter kits, which is the Penguin Historical Atlas of the Vikings, which is full of prose, so this will double very well as a one-volume history of the Viking era, the so-called Viking era. But it also has these incomparable visuals that really do serve to remind you not only of the fact, but also of the extent of the fact that the Viking era was not just that raid on Lindisfarne. So there was a lot more. The Vikings traveled far and wide. They were masters of the sea. And this obviously does a really good visual job of quantifying that. So I thought I would include it just to concentrate on the Vikings here for a bit. But they were one part of the 1,000 years that we're looking at. But I don't think you have to be an 8-year-old boy to concede that they are probably the most interesting part of that 1,000 years. Or maybe you do need to be an 8-year-old boy. If so, I gladly confess guilt. Anyway, this era, the 1,000 years that we're talking about, of course, was full of people. I mentioned 1066. That is William the Conqueror. But lots of other people too. You could learn all about the Middle Ages simply by reading your way through biographies. Popes, embattled popes, prelates, kings of England, kings of France, major Vikings. All you could do a lot of this period that way through biographies. But I wanted to put a biography on this list. For doing that, I want to pick another utterly remarkable thing. So I'm being a little unfair here for a starter kit, because the Vikings are not the whole of the Middle Ages, obviously. They're just so interesting, and they happen right in our time period. And the same thing with the biography. I could have made this whole list biographies. But instead, I'm going to pick one figure, an utterly remarkable figure from our time period, and that figure is Joan of Arc. And Helen Castor's biography of Joan of Arc, which will tell you a lot about the medieval church. A lot about medieval religious wars. You'll also learn a lot about this figure. But this is terrific reading, and it's terrific reading through a biographical lens, which I haven't done yet on this list, and I wanted to make sure to do it, because biography is my favorite kind of reading. But when we're done with the broad history and then the specifics in history, do you want to read about the Black Death? Do you want to read about mercantile houses of Florence and Venice? Do you want to read about religious wars, Joan of Arc? Do you want to read about the Wars of the Roses, or whatever the historical detail is? When you're done with the broader history and you're done with whatever historical era or aspect you want to concentrate on, there's one other massive aspect of the Middle Ages that I want to finish out with. And that is the literature of the Middle Ages, which is full of immortal works that are still with us. But all of the works really form a kind of prism through which you can look at the age. And the best scholarly editions of these literature will all have that to help you. That will be all over their notes, all over their introductions, to help you look at how this era looked at itself, what it valued enough to repeat or rewrite. So I want to go through some titans of medieval literature, that in case you want to go at the period that way. Maybe, for instance, your history reading muscles are not in the best of shape. Maybe you'd rather go at it through its literature. Perfectly valid. Works for any time period. So let's do that. Let's look at some literature to wrap this up. And we'll start with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Now, this is the Simon Armitage translation. It was very, very popular. It's quite good. This is a strange, I think, beautiful story. Upsetting and also sexual and smart story about a giant green knight who comes to the court of King Arthur. And he makes a deal. I will take a savage blow from your bravest knight, and then in a year he will take a savage blow from me. And Sir Gawain decides to take the challenge and realizes to himself, well, if I cut his head off, then I won't have to answer his challenge. If I kill him, then there's no danger of the challenge. So he lops the Green Knight's head off, and the Green Knight bends down, picks it up, gets back on his green horse, and says, I'll see you in a year. Which leaves young Gawain knowing that he is doomed. He knows he can't pick up his head and walk off with it. And what results is an extremely strange poem, a wonderful poem that has been translated 1,000,000 times, including by Tolkien. So with any translation, I'm not recommending the Simon Armitage here. I can recommend it, but I'm not saying this is the one to read. Pick a translation of this that appeals to you, and just go with that. Then we have Beowulf. Also a medieval story that also needs no introduction, of the story of a superpowered man who decides to fight monsters. First for renown, and then for, anyway, there are three main monsters in the book. I'm sure you know the basic story of Beowulf and Grendel. And it has been translated a number of times. This is one of those instances where I might actually be preferring a translation. The Seamus Heaney translation of Beowulf is universally lauded, and I think justly so. Whether or not it would satisfy a strict medieval linguist, I'm not 100% sure. In fact, I'm 100% sure it wouldn't. But as a first-time reader of Beowulf, you could not do better than to read this and not worry at the beginning what the linguists think about anything. Just read this for the marvel of translation that Seamus Heaney does for it. But Beowulf would be another one, and we'll just move on. Like, for instance, we have an example of a work from the long Middle Ages here that is great. It is canonical, and it is also readable. you can read it without a translation. And that is The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. This is the cover of the big, fat Penguin paperback that is not by Neville Coghill. This is just Chaucer, with glosses for every line of the words or phrases that might seem a little odd to you. But here you are just reading Chaucer, which is possible to do and preferable to do. Chaucer was an absolute master of the nuances of his kind of English. So reading what he wrote and gradually attuning your ear to the nuances, the puns, the verbal echoes and whatnot, the homophonic echoes, training your ear to what he was writing instead of just reading a modern version of it is very preferable. It will profit you. You will like it better. If not, there are plenty of modern English versions of Chaucer to do. If you try this and you're not willing to give it, I think you need about a week to break down the strangeness of it and just read it on the page. If you're not willing to take that long, you want to just read the gist of it, there are plenty of English versions. But The Canterbury Tales is one of my favorite books, so of course it had to be on here. And we'll also include another one of my favorite books. This is the Divine Comedy by Dante, which not only is fascinating reading, but also lays out a lot of the medieval conception of religion, of Christianity. And again, any good version that you get of this book, not ironically enough this version, this is the Barnes & Noble Deluxe Classic, which has almost no annotations, but any good version, a scholarly version you get of this book that has annotations, will lay out all of that for you. Where this coincides with religious thought in the Middle Ages, how it differs from it, what it establishes. It is amazing. A fact little known to most. For instance, I live in the United States, an intensely religious country, and the huge swath of the middle of the state is intensely fundamentalist Christian. And those intensely fundamentalist Christians would have no idea how much of what they believe about their theology comes from Dante, not from the Bible. They have no idea. They'd be amazed if you got it through to them. Of course, you shouldn't, because they'll kill you. But if they were to learn that peacefully, they would be amazed. So even just the notes of this are well worth reading. The book is also great, I should point out. And then right at the end of the period that we're talking about, in fact, the same ending year that we're talking about, comes Les Morts d'Arthur by Thomas Malory. A pulling together and a syncretization of the Arthurian mythos that is at the back of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, written centuries before this. So Malory also, like Chaucer, has a kind of cadence of his own. Once you get used to it, I think you'll find it really, really good, really enjoyable way to read a gigantic book. But this is the Bible of Arthurian stuff, which is Arthurian stuff is connected with the heart and soul of all of the literary leanings of the Middle Ages, so well worth your time to know it well. And then when we're done with the works of the Middle Ages, those are the big ones. There's the biggest one of all, is I did not mention. The biggest work of all of literature in the Middle Ages was something called The Romance of the Rose, but it's never had a great translation, and it is also dead as a work of literature in a way that, thankfully, the Canterbury Tales, the Divine Comedy especially, will never be. Not quite sure what explains that, but it is definitely true. There is no actual modern, normal resonance left in Romance of the Rose. But for the 1,000 years that we're talking about, if you'd gone up to someone and said, I like books, that's the first thing they said, oh, the Romance of the Rose. So I left that out here because it's for the kind of people I don't want commenting on this video. But when we're done with the Middle Ages literature, I thought we would finish up on a little lighter note with the literature about the Middle Ages in our own time. Historical fiction set in the Middle Ages, in the broader and the longer Middle Ages that we're talking about here. So we can start with Anya Seton. This is her book, Catherine. Her historical novel, Catherine. A little bit longer in the tooth than some of the things that I want to talk about here, but still very good. This was done in an era when even sudsy novelists like Anya Seton did a lot of research for their books. A lot of solid research. And this also tells a wonderful tale that is also tangentially touched on in the life of Geoffrey Chaucer. Then we can move to Doorstop. This is a huge book, but it is one of the most popular works of medieval historical fiction that's ever been written, and certainly one of the most popular in our own era, and that is Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. a gigantic novel about the slow generational building of a cathedral. In the 12th century, when you had horsepower, even that was very inefficient, and you had nothing else. You had no hydraulics, you had no electricity, nothing like that. These marvelous buildings were built through generational effort, generational wealth accumulation, generational devotion, and Ken Follett captures a lot of that really well. In this book, he captures the spirit of that, not so much the facts, but the spirit of that really well, in addition to laying on a cheesy plot. He was before he wrote a massive work of historical fiction and became known as a writer of historical fiction. He was known as a master of cheesy plots. There's a cheesy plot in this book that will please you. This is one of the easiest 1,000-page books to read. Then we can deal with another work of medieval historical fiction that is not as easy to read as Pillars of the Earth. It is considerably better, enormously more intelligent, and also, in a happy side note, was also a meteoric bestseller. It was the author's debut, and it made him independently wealthy. And that is The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, about a monk who goes to a monastery, and the monastery is copying manuscripts like all monasteries did, and that monastery has a horrible secret. And it's not what you first think. When you get halfway through this book and realize some of the sordid personal dealings of the monks in the monastery, you think you know the secret. But the secret is actually worse than that. The secret is actually literary. This is marvelous. It is infinitely rereadable. So I had to include it on this list. 30 years ago, it would have been the only thing on this list. And then we can finish up with another work roughly set in the Middle Ages. If you bear down deep on some of the dropped comments in the book, it seems like it's set around the end of our time period, around the end of the Wars of the Roses, although Henry II gets mentioned quite as well. This is also Arthurian, and it is The Once and Future King by T.H. White. So we started out with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, we moved on to Thomas Malory, and now we're dealing with T.H. White. This is his grand piece of Arthurian fiction. If you don't know the book, you certainly know the title. The title has been adapted into common parlance. But if you don't know the book, you certainly know the beginning. This book is broken into 4 parts, and the first part is The Sword and the Stone, where young Arthur is taught all sorts of life lessons by Merlin the magician that involve transforming him into different kinds of animals. So there was a Disney cartoon that was beloved by a whole generation. The Sword and the Stone is printed separate from this book and is always available in the children's section of any retail bookstore. The rest of the story goes on from here. Arthur pulls the sword from the stone at the end of the first part, and then is king, and has to unify his kingdom, and marry his queen, who then falls in love with his best friend. So it's a story that is well known, and T.H. White writes it like nobody's business. So I wanted to end our medieval starter kit on a really strong point. And also, ironically, a point that largely floats free of any of the historical stuff that we were dealing with at the beginning. You don't need any preparation to read The Once and Future King. None at all. But anyway, there you go. Some history, some maps, some bloodthirsty Vikings, a biography, and then some literature as a medieval starter kit. So I hope that there were things in here that were of interest to you. You read these things, you'll be well set on your way for studying the Middle Ages. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.